Venezuela calls the bluff and Washington is stunned.
Let me take you back to the morning of January 10, 2024.
That's the day Nicolas Maduro, in a move that caught nearly every Western intelligence agency flat-footed, announced that Venezuela would formally annex the Essequibo region, a 160,000 square kilometer territory long disputed with Guyana, but one that just so happens to sit atop some of the largest untapped oil reserves in the world. The announcement wasn't just a diplomatic provocation, it was a calculated geopolitical chess move, one that forced the United States to reveal the limits of its influence in its own backyard.
And Washington? Well, Washington was stunned.
Now, if you've been following the headlines, you might think this is just another chapter in the long, sordid saga of Venezuelan authoritarianism, a rogue state thumbing its nose at international law, daring the US to do something about it. The official narrative, after all, is clean, and Maduro, desperate to distract from his collapsing economy and rigged elections, is manufacturing a crisis to rally nationalist support.
The US, ever the reluctant global policeman, is now faced with a choice: do we let Venezuela get away with it, or do we enforce the rules-based order?
The media has framed this as a test of American resolve, a moment where the Biden administration must decide whether to project strength or risk appearing weak in an election year. But here's the problem with that: it's incomplete at best, and deliberately misleading at worst.
Let me tell you what's really happening.
I've spent the better part of 3 decades studying Latin American geopolitics, and I can tell you this much: what we're witnessing isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the unraveling of American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere, the rise of a multipolar world order, and the quiet but seismic shift in how great powers now compete for influence.
Maduro's move wasn't just a bluff.
It was a call, one that exposed the hollowness of Washington's post-Cold War dominance in its own neighborhood. And the fact that the US was caught so off guard tells you everything you need to know about how much the ground has shifted beneath its feet.
So let's start by deconstructing the official story.
Then, we'll dig into what's actually at stake, because this isn't just about a border dispute. It's about oil, great power competition, and the slow-motion collapse of the American empire.
The official, what they want you to believe. Here's how the story is being sold to.
Venezuela, under Nicolas Maduro, is a failed state. Its economy has shrunk by more than 75% since 2013.
Hyperinflation has rendered the bolivar worthless. Millions have fled, creating one of the worst refugee crises in the hemisphere.
And Maduro, facing a legitimacy crisis after sham elections in 2024, has turned to nationalism to cling to power. The Essequibo dispute, a territorial conflict dating back to the 19th century, is the perfect distraction. By stoking tensions with Guyana, Maduro can rally Venezuelans around the flag, portray himself as a defender of national sovereignty, and shift attention away from his own failures. The US, meanwhile, has a clear interest in stability. Guyana is a key ally, a democracy, and, crucially, a major new player in the global oil market. ExxonMobil's massive offshore discoveries in the Stabroek Block have turned Guyana into the world's fastest-growing oil economy. Venezuela's annexation threats, then, aren't just about land, they're about control over a resource that could reshape global energy markets. The Biden administration, already under fire for its handling of Ukraine, the Middle East, and China, can't afford to look weak. So when Maduro held a referendum in December 2023 claiming Venezuelan sovereignty over Essequibo, despite international law and a 2020 ICJ ruling against Venezuela, Washington had to respond.
And respond it did.
The US conducted joint military exercises with Guyana in December, deployed a Coast Guard cutter to the region, and publicly reaffirmed its commitment to Guyana's territorial integrity.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken called Maduro's moves provocative and irresponsible.
The Pentagon quietly increased surveillance flights over the Essequibo. And in January, when Maduro followed through with his annexation decree, the US condemned it as a violation of international law. The message was, don't test us. But here's the thing: Venezuela did test them.
And Washington's response?
A lot of bluster, a few military exercises, and not much else.
No sanctions escalation. No talk of regime change. No serious military threats. Just a lot of diplomatic hand-wringing.
And that's where the official narrative starts to fall apart. Because if this were really about enforcing the rules-based order, the US would have acted by now. If this were really about protecting a democratic ally, we'd be seeing the kind of muscular interventionism that defined American foreign policy in the 20th century.
But we're not.
And that tells you something. Washington knows it's bluffing.
So what's actually going on? Deconstructing the what the data and the silence reveal. Let's start with the facts that don't fit the official story. Fact number 1: Venezuela's military is far stronger than Washington wants to admit.
The US has spent the last 2 decades treating Venezuela like a paper tiger, a broken country with a hollowed-out military, incapable of projecting power beyond its borders.
But that's not entirely true.
Yes, Venezuela's economy is in shambles. Yes, its conventional military has suffered from years of underfunding. But here's what most analysts: Venezuela's military is still one of the most capable in South America when it comes to asymmetric warfare.
I've studied the Venezuelan armed forces up close.
They may not have the latest F-35s, but they've got something far more dangerous in this Russian and Chinese backing. Since 2014, Venezuela has been a key recipient of Russian arms, including S-300 air defense systems, T-72 tanks, and Su-30 fighter jets. They've also received Chinese radar systems, drones, and cyber warfare capabilities. And let's not forget the Wagner Group's rumored presence in the country, something U.S. intelligence has been tracking for years.
Now, could Venezuela win a conventional war against Guyana? Probably not. Guyana's military is tiny, just 3,000 active personnel. But that's not the point. The point is that any Venezuelan military action in Essequibo would trigger a U.S. response. And that's where things get messy. Because here's the dirty little: the US doesn't actually want a war with Venezuela. Not now. Not in an election year. Not when the American public is already exhausted from 2 decades of forever wars. And certainly not when the US is already stretched thin in Ukraine, the Middle East, and the Taiwan Strait. The Pentagon knows that any kinetic action in Venezuela would require a massive deployment, one that would take months to organize, cost billions, and risk dragging the US into another quagmire. And that's exactly why Maduro called Washington's bluff. Fact number 2: the US
has no good military options.
Let's game this out. What are Washington's real options if Venezuela invades Essequibo? Option 1: airstrikes.
The US could conduct limited airstrikes on Venezuelan military targets, radar installations, air defense systems, maybe a few key command centers.
But here's the: Venezuela has Russian air defenses. The S-300 system is no joke.
If the US starts bombing, it risks losing aircraft and pilots to Russian-made missiles.
And that's before we even get to the political fallout.
A US airstrike on Venezuela would be the first direct American military action in Latin America since the 1989 invasion of AMA.
The backlash in the region would be immediate and severe. Every leftist government in Latin America, from Mexico to Brazil to Colombia, would condemn it. The US would be isolated. And Maduro? He'd become a martyr. Option 2: Special Forces raid.
The US could send in Delta Force or SEAL Team 6 to sabotage key infrastructure, oil refineries, ports, maybe even Maduro himself.
But again, the risks are enormous.
Venezuela has one of the most sophisticated counterintelligence networks in the region.
The chances of a botched operation, like the 2019 failed coup attempt, are high. And if US operatives are captured? That's a propaganda goldmine for Maduro. Option 3: full-scale invasion. This is the nuclear option.
The US could launch a AMA-style invasion, overthrow Maduro, and install a pro-American government.
But let's be real, this isn't 1989. Venezuela is not AMA.
It's a country of 28 million people, with a military that, while weakened, is still capable of waging a prolonged insurgency. The US would need hundreds of thousands of troops to occupy Venezuela.
And even then, the chances of success are slim. Look at Iraq. Look at Afghanistan.
The US has a terrible track record when it comes to nation building in hostile environments.
And Venezuela? It's far more complex than either of those. So what's left? Diplomacy. And that's exactly what the US has been reduced to. Fact number 3: the US is desperately trying to avoid escalation. Here's where it gets interesting. Despite all the tough talk, the Biden administration has been extremely careful not to cross any red lines. When Maduro held his referendum in December, the U.S. response was muted. When he announced the annexation in January, the U.S. condemned it but didn't impose new sanctions. When Venezuela sent troops to the border, the U.S. sent a Coast Guard cutter but no warships. Why? Because the U.S. knows that any military escalation risks triggering a response from Venezuela's allies, Russia and China. And that's the real geopolitical game here. The great power how Russia and China are playing Venezuela. Let me be, this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the broader struggle for influence in the Western Hemisphere, a region that the U.S. has long considered its exclusive sphere of influence. And right now, Russia and China are making a play for it. Russia's the spoiler. Russia has been Venezuela's most important military and diplomatic backer for over a decade. But in the last 2 years, that relationship has deepened dramatically. In 2022, Russia and Venezuela signed an $11 billion economic cooperation deal, one that included everything from oil exploration to military training. In 2023, Russia sent nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela for joint exercises, a move that was clearly a message to Washington. And in early 2024, as tensions over Essequibo escalated, Russia quietly deployed additional military advisors to Venezuela. Now, here's the Russia doesn't actually want Venezuela to invade Guyana. That would be a disaster for Moscow. It would force the U.S. to respond, risking a direct confrontation that Russia doesn't want. What Russia does want is to tie the U.S. down in its own backyard. Every dollar, every troop, every diplomatic resource that the U.S. spends on Venezuela is a dollar, a troop, a resource that isn't being spent on Ukraine. And that's exactly what's happening. The U.S. is now in the worst of all possible. It's committed to defending Guyana, but it can't actually enforce that commitment without risking a wider war. And Russia? Russia is laughing all the way to the bank. China's the long game. China's involvement in Venezuela is even more strategic. While Russia plays the spoiler, China is playing the long game, securing access to Venezuela's oil, rare earth minerals, and, yes, its geopolitical leverage. China is Venezuela's largest creditor. It's invested billions in Venezuelan infrastructure, ports, railroads, even a space satellite program. And in 2023, China and Venezuela signed a 25-year strategic partnership, one that includes military cooperation, intelligence sharing, and, crucially, oil for loans deals that bypass U.S. sanctions. Now, here's the China doesn't care about Essequibo. At least, not directly. What China does care about is preventing the U.S. from reasserting dominance in Latin America. And Venezuela is the perfect wedge. By keeping Maduro in power, China ensures that the U.S. remains bogged down in a crisis it can't solve, one that drains American resources, weakens its global standing, and, most importantly, keeps Latin America open for Chinese investment. And it's working. The unipolar moment is why this is bigger than Venezuela. Here's the hard: the U.S. is no longer the undisputed hegemon in its own hemisphere. And Venezuela's defiance is just the latest symptom of that reality. For decades, the U.S. operated under the assumption that it could dictate terms to Latin America. Regime change in Chile? Done. Invasion of AMA? Done. Coup in Honduras? Done. But those days are over. The world has changed. And the U.S. is still trying to play by the old rules, rules that no longer apply. The rise of multipolarity. We are living in a multipolar world now. The U.S. is still the most powerful country on Earth, but it's no longer the only one. China is a peer competitor. Russia is a spoiler. And regional powers, Turkey, Iran, India, Brazil, are increasingly asserting their own interests. In this new world, spheres of influence matter. And Latin America? It's Russia and China's sphere of influence now, at least, in part. The U.S. can huff and puff all it wants about the rules-based order. But when push comes to shove, great powers do what they want. And right now, Russia and China are doing exactly what they want in Venezuela, with impunity. The hypocrisy of American foreign policy. Let's talk about hypocrisy for a second. The US condemns Venezuela for violating international law in Essequibo. But what about Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights? What about Russia's annexation of Crimea? What about China's claims in the South China Sea?
The US picks and chooses when to enforce the rules-based order.
And that's exactly why countries like Venezuela, Russia, and China don't take American threats seriously anymore. They see the double standards. They see the empty bluster. And they call it the lesson of Ukraine. Here's another hard: the US is stretched too thin. The war in Ukraine has drained American resources. The conflict in the Middle East has divided the West.
And China's rise in the Pacific has forced the US to shift its focus eastward.
Venezuela knows this. Russia knows this. China knows this. And they're exploiting it.
The US can't fight a war in Ukraine, a war in the Middle East, and a war in Venezuela.
Not at the same time.
And that's exactly why Maduro's move was so brilliant.
He forced the US to reveal its limits. Military: why a US intervention would be a disaster. Let's talk about what would actually happen if the US decided to intervene in Venezuela. The logistics nightmare. First, the US would need to deploy. And that's not as easy as it sounds.
The US has some forces in the region, mostly in Colombia, Honduras, and Puerto Rico. But to launch a full-scale invasion, the US would need to move hundreds of thousands of troops, along with tanks, aircraft, and naval assets. That would take months. And during that time, Venezuela would have plenty of warning. Now, let's say the US does invade. What then? The insurgency problem. Venezuela has one of the most heavily armed civilian populations in the world. The country has millions of guns in private hands.
And if the US invades, those guns will be used. We're not just talking about a few rebels with AK-47s. We're talking about a full-blown insurgency, one that could drag on for years. And let's not Venezuela has allies. Russia and China would absolutely provide weapons, intelligence, and diplomatic cover.
Iran would likely send advisors.
Cuba would send troops. And every leftist government in Latin America would condemn the US invasion. The economic fallout. An invasion of Venezuela would destroy the global oil market.
Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world.
If the US invades, Venezuela would shut down its oil production. Prices would skyrocket. And in an election year? That's political suicide. The geopolitical domino effect.
And then there's the bigger picture.
If the US invades Venezuela, every country in Latin America would start looking for new allies. Mexico would move closer to China.
Brazil would pivot toward Russia.
Colombia would reconsider its US ties. The US would lose Latin America permanently.
So no, a US invasion of Venezuela is not a quick and easy solution.
It's a disaster waiting to happen.
The domestic political why Biden can't afford to lose Venezuela.
Now, let's talk about the real reason the US is so hesitant to politics. The 2024 election. Joe Biden is in a tight race for re-election. Now, what most people don't realize is that Biden isn't just worried about the election, he's trapped in a legacy dilemma. Venezuela has become the third rail of US foreign policy, and touching it could electrocute his entire presidency.
Let me explain why this matters beyond the usual partisan bickering.
First, there's the ghost of Iraq. Remember 2003?
The Bush administration sold the invasion of Iraq as a cakewalk, WMDs, democracy, freedom fries.
We all know how that turned out.
The American public has zero appetite for another forever war, especially one that would make Iraq look like a skirmish. Polling from Pew Research in 2023 showed that 62% of Americans oppose military intervention in foreign conflicts, even when framed as humanitarian.
That number jumps to 78% when you mention regime change.
Biden, who was in the Senate during the Iraq War and later served as Obama's vice president, remembers the political cost of overreach. He's not about to repeat Bush's mistakes, especially when his own party is deeply divided on foreign policy. Here's the uncomfortable: the Democratic base has shifted. The progressive wing of the party, led by figures like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders, has made anti-interventionism a core tenet of its platform. In 2020, Sanders won the Nevada caucus in part because of his opposition to regime change wars.
Even moderate Democrats like Elizabeth Warren have called for ending endless wars.
If Biden greenlights an invasion of Venezuela, he risks a primary challenge from the left, or at the very least, a demoralized base that stays home in November.
And let's not Trump is already weaponizing this.
His campaign has been running ads accusing Biden of being weak on Venezuela, framing it as a national security failure. If Biden invades, Trump will pivot to calling it Biden's war, just like he did with Afghanistan. If Biden does nothing, Trump will call him feckless.
It's a no-win scenario.
But the political calculus gets even uglier when you factor in the Latino vote. Florida is the ultimate swing state, and Cuban and Venezuelan exiles in Miami have been a reliable Republican voting bloc since the 1960s. In 2020, Trump won Miami-Dade County by 7 points, an astonishing flip from 2016, when Clinton won it by nearly 30.
Why? Because Trump hammered Biden on socialism, Venezuela, and Cuba. The messaging was Biden will turn America into Venezuela. It worked.
Now, imagine if Biden actually invades Venezuela.
The Cuban and Venezuelan diaspora in Florida would erupt.
The GOP would run ads showing footage of U.S. troops in Caracas with the Biden's war paid for with your tax dollars.
It's a nightmare scenario for Democrats.
And then there's the military's perspective. The Pentagon has been quietly pushing back against any talk of intervention for years. In 2019, then Secretary of Defense Mark Esper reportedly told Trump that an invasion of Venezuela would require a force larger than the one used in Iraq.
That's not hyperbole.
Venezuela's military, while poorly equipped, is battle-hardened from years of suppressing protests and dealing with armed gangs. The country has a population of 28 million, with a standing army of 123,000 and a militia of nearly 2 million.
That's not counting the colectivos, armed pro-government gangs that operate like a state-sponsored paramilitary force.
The U.S. military knows this isn't a fight it can win quickly, if at all.
Let me give you a historical parallel.
In 1961, the Kennedy administration backed the Bay of Pigs invasion, a CIA-led operation to overthrow Fidel Castro. It was a disaster. The Cuban military crushed the invaders in 3 days, and Kennedy was humiliated. The fallout was so severe that it led directly to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, imagine a Bay of Pigs-style operation in Venezuela, but with Russia and China supplying advanced anti-aircraft systems and cyber warfare capabilities. The U.S. would be walking into a buzzsaw. And that brings me to the broader military implications.
Venezuela isn't just a country, it's a proxy battleground.
Russia has already deployed nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela, most recently in 2018.
China has invested billions in Venezuelan infrastructure, including ports and telecommunications. Iran has sent oil tankers to bypass U.S. sanctions.
If the U.S. invades, it's not just fighting Venezuela, it's risking a direct confrontation with 3 nuclear-armed powers. The Pentagon's 2022 National Defense Strategy explicitly identifies China and Russia as the top threats to U.S. security.
Starting a war in Venezuela would be a gift to both. Here's another angle: most analysts, the U.S. military is already stretched thin.
The Army is struggling to meet recruitment goals. The Navy is dealing with a shipbuilding crisis. The Air Force is facing a pilot shortage. And let's not the U.S. is still supporting Ukraine, maintaining a presence in the Middle East, and preparing for a potential conflict with China over Taiwan. Adding Venezuela to that list would break the military's back. The last thing the Pentagon wants is another open-ended commitment in a country where the U.S. has no clear exit strategy. But the real kicker? The U.S. doesn't need to invade Venezuela to achieve its goals. That's the part that drives me crazy when I hear the hawks in Washington. They act like military force is the only option, but it's not. The U.S. has already crippled Venezuela's economy with sanctions. The country's GDP has shrunk by 75% since 2013. Inflation hit 1,000,000% in 2018.
The US has frozen billions in Venezuelan assets abroad. The regime is isolated diplomatically. So why risk everything on an invasion when the sanctions are already working?
The answer is because the hawks don't actually want Maduro gone.
They want him weakened, not defeated.
A stable, democratic Venezuela would be a disaster for U.S. strategic interests. It would mean a government that could negotiate with China and Russia on equal terms. It would mean an end to the oil sanctions that have kept Venezuelan crude off the market, which would lower global prices and hurt U.S. shale producers.
It would mean a Latin American country that isn't dependent on U.S. aid or approval. And that's the last thing Washington wants.
So when I see the U.S. government acting shocked that Venezuela called its bluff, I have to laugh.
Of course Venezuela called the bluff. They know the U.S. isn't willing to invade. They know the sanctions are a paper tiger. And they know that every time the U.S. threatens military action, it makes Washington look weak. Maduro isn't stupid.
He's playing a long game, and right now, he's winning.
The question: what happens next? The U.S. can't back down without looking feckless, but it can't escalate without risking a catastrophe. My bet? We'll see more of the same sanctions, rhetoric, and the occasional half-hearted coup attempt. Because in the end, the U.S. doesn't want to solve the Venezuela problem. It wants to manage it. And that's the most cynical truth of all.
Now, what most people don't realize is that this stalemate isn't just about Maduro versus Washington, it's about the fractures inside Venezuela itself, and how those fractures are being exploited, or ignored, depending on who you ask.
Let's start with the opposition.
For years, the U.S. has treated Juan Guaidó like a chess piece, propping him up as the legitimate president in 2019 with the backing of over 50 countries. But here's the uncomfortable: Guaidó was never more than a symbol. He had no real power base, no military support, and no ability to govern. The U.S. knew this, but they needed a figurehead to justify their sanctions and diplomatic pressure.
The problem?
When you treat a man like a president without giving him the tools to actually be one, you create a credibility crisis. By 2023, Guaidó's approval rating had plummeted to single digits, and even his own allies started abandoning him. The U.S. finally dropped its recognition of him in early 2024, not because they suddenly saw the light, but because he had become a liability.
That's not strategy, that's desperation. But the opposition isn't just Guaidó.
There are other players, like Maria Corina Machado, who won the opposition primary in 2023 with over 90% of the vote.
She's a hardliner, a free market absolutist who makes even some U.S. policymakers nervous.
The Maduro government barred her from running in the 2024 election, which was neither free nor fair, but let's be honest, Machado's vision for Venezuela isn't exactly a unifying one. She's talked about privatizing PDVSA, the state oil company, which would be a political earthquake in a country where oil has been the backbone of the economy for a century. The U.S. loves to talk about democracy, but when a candidate like Machado emerges, they suddenly get quiet.
Why?
Because a Venezuela that actually democratizes might not be the pliant, dependent client state Washington wants. It might be one that negotiates with China on its own terms, or worse, one that demands fair prices for its oil without U.S. interference.
Let me explain why this matters.
The U.S. has spent the last decade trying to turn Venezuela into a cautionary tale about socialism, but the real lesson is about the limits of coercion.
Sanctions haven't toppled Maduro, but they have destroyed the middle class.
The Venezuelan professional class, doctors, engineers, teachers, has fled by the millions. Over 7 million people have left since 2015, creating the largest refugee crisis in the Western Hemisphere.
That's not just a humanitarian disaster, it's a strategic one.
A country without a functioning civil society can't transition to democracy, even if Maduro falls. The U.S. seems to think that if they just squeeze hard enough, the regime will collapse like a house of cards.
But authoritarian regimes don't work that way. They adapt.
Maduro has survived by creating a parallel economy, one that runs on dollars, gold, and cryptocurrency. The sanctions have hurt, but they've also forced the regime to become more self-sufficient. Venezuela's oil production is still a fraction of what it was in the 1990s, but it's not zero. And with Russia and Iran helping to evade sanctions, Maduro has enough revenue to keep the military loyal and the elites happy.
Here's the thing that keeps me up: the US isn't just failing to solve the Venezuela problem, it's making it worse.
Every time Washington tightens the screws, Maduro tightens his grip. The 2018 sanctions on PDVSA were supposed to starve the regime of cash, but instead, they pushed Venezuela into the arms of China and Russia. Beijing has lent Caracas over $60 billion since 2007, and Moscow has sent military advisors and cybersecurity experts. The US acts like it's the only game in town, but Venezuela has options. And the more the US isolates Maduro, the more he turns to those options.
So what's the endgame? I see three possible scenarios, none of them pretty.
The first is the status a slow-motion collapse where Venezuela becomes a failed state, but not a failed regime. Maduro stays in power, the economy limps along, and the US keeps pretending it has a strategy.
This is the most likely outcome, because it's the one that requires the least effort from everyone involved.
The second scenario is a negotiated transition, where Maduro trades power for immunity and the opposition agrees to some form of power sharing.
This is what the US and the EU have been pushing for, but it's a long shot.
Maduro has no incentive to negotiate unless he's facing an existential threat, and right now, he isn't. The third scenario is the wildest sudden collapse, either through a coup, a popular uprising, or a split in the military. This is what the hawks in Washington dream about, but it's also the most dangerous. A chaotic transition could plunge Venezuela into civil war, or worse, create a power vacuum that outside actors like Russia or China rush to fill.
The uncomfortable truth is that none of these scenarios serve US interests in the long run.
A stable, democratic Venezuela would be a nightmare for Washington, because it would mean a country that doesn't need US approval to sell its oil or buy weapons. A failed Venezuela is better for the US, because it keeps the country weak and dependent. But here's the longer this goes on, the harder it becomes to reverse the damage. Venezuela isn't just a geopolitical chess piece, it's a country of 28 million people, and every day this crisis drags on, more of them lose hope. So when I hear US officials talk about restoring democracy in Venezuela, I have to lose democracy. The one where the US picks the leaders? The one where the opposition is too divided to govern? Or the one where the people actually get a say, but the outcome isn't what Washington wants? The US has spent decades trying to control Venezuela, and all it's done is make the problem worse. Maybe it's time to admit that the only way out is to let Venezuela find its own path, even if that path isn't the one the US would choose. But don't hold your breath. Washington would rather manage a crisis than solve one. And that, in the end, is the real tragedy. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the broader unraveling of US hegemony in Latin America, and Washington's refusal to accept that its old playbook no longer works. The Biden administration, like its predecessors, still operates under the assumption that if it applies enough pressure, sanctions, diplomatic isolation, even the occasional covert operation, Venezuela will eventually crack. But that's not how power works in the 21st century. Maduro has survived not because he's a genius, but because he's adapted to a world where the US is no longer the only game in town. Russia, China, Iran, and even Turkey have stepped in to fill the void left by American sanctions, turning Venezuela into a testing ground for a new kind of multipolar resistance. Let me explain why this matters. In 2019, when the US recognized Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's interim president, it was a classic case of wishful thinking. The Trump administration assumed that if it declared Maduro illegitimate, the rest of the world would fall in line. It didn't. The EU hedged, China and Russia doubled down on their support for Maduro, and even some of Venezuela's neighbors, like Mexico and Argentina, refused to go along with the charade. Fast forward to 2024, and Guaidó is a political non-entity, living in exile while Maduro consolidates his grip on power. The US bet everything on regime change, and it lost. But instead of admitting defeat, Washington has doubled down on a strategy that's clearly not working. Here's the uncomfortable: the US doesn't actually want a democratic Venezuela. What it wants is a Venezuela that's stable enough to avoid a refugee crisis but weak enough to be controlled. That's why the Biden administration has been quietly easing sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector, not out of any sudden commitment to democracy,
but because it needs Venezuelan crude to keep global energy markets stable. The problem is that this half-hearted approach satisfies no one.
The opposition feels betrayed, Maduro sees it as a sign of weakness, and the Venezuelan people are left wondering why, after years of suffering, nothing has changed.
So what are the alternatives? The first is what I call the realist reset.
The US could accept that Maduro isn't going anywhere and start treating Venezuela like any other authoritarian state, engaging with it when necessary, containing it when possible, but not wasting political capital on regime change. This would mean lifting sanctions in exchange for concrete concessions, like free and fair elections, but without the illusion that Maduro will ever play by Washington's rules. The second alternative is the Cold War model, where the US treats Venezuela like it treated Cuba during the Cold War, isolating it economically, supporting opposition groups, and waiting for the regime to collapse under its own weight. The problem with this approach is that it didn't work in Cuba, and it's not going to work in Venezuela, where the government has proven far more resilient than anyone expected.
The third alternative is the one no one in Washington wants to talk: doing nothing.
Letting Venezuela sort itself out, even if that means a prolonged period of instability. This is the hardest option for the US to accept, because it means admitting that it no longer has the power to shape outcomes in its own backyard. But here's the Venezuela's crisis isn't just a US problem. It's a regional problem, and the longer the US tries to solve it alone, the worse it gets. The countries that have the most leverage over Venezuela, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, have all tried to mediate, with mixed results. But at least they're not pretending that they can impose a solution from the outside.
Let me give you an example.
In 2023, Brazil's Lula da Silva tried to broker a deal between Maduro and the opposition, offering Venezuela a path back into regional organizations like Mercosur in exchange for electoral reforms. The US initially supported the effort, but then undercut it by reimposing sanctions just as the talks were gaining momentum.
Why? Because Washington couldn't resist the urge to meddle. The result?
Maduro walked away, the opposition splintered, and the crisis deepened. This is what happens when you have a superpower that's used to getting its way, but no longer has the tools to make it happen.
Now, I'm not saying the US should just walk away and let Venezuela burn.
But it needs to accept that its current strategy is a dead end.
The sanctions have failed.
The recognition of Guaidó was a farce.
The covert operations, like the 2020 Bay of Piglets fiasco, where a ragtag group of mercenaries tried to invade Venezuela and capture Maduro, were a joke.
The only thing the US has left is the threat of military intervention, and no one, not even the most hawkish members of Congress, actually wants that.
So what's the endgame?
Here's why the US will continue to muddle through, easing sanctions when it needs oil, tightening them when it wants to punish Maduro, and pretending that it's still in control. Meanwhile, Venezuela will remain a broken country, its people trapped between a corrupt government and an opposition that's too divided to offer a real alternative. The refugees will keep coming, the economy will keep shrinking, and the geopolitical standoff will drag on, with Russia and China using Venezuela as a pawn in their own games.
And the US?
It will keep telling itself that it's defending democracy, even as it does everything in its power to prevent one. In the end, the real tragedy isn't that Venezuela is a failed state. It's that the US has become so addicted to managing crises that it can't imagine a world where it doesn't have to.
Venezuela's future will be decided by Venezuelans, not by Washington.
The sooner the US accepts that, the sooner it can start dealing with the world as it is, rather than the world it wishes it were.
But don't hold your breath.
For now, the bluff continues, and the only ones paying the price are the people who can least afford it.